it's kind of like how, like, maybe that's something that needs to be thought about more, like the time involved in processing information is something that when you're browsing and surfing the web, you seem to read the first sentence and then the second sentence and then look at the picture and then you see a link that looks more interesting and then bang, you're off somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe one of the major drawbacks of
That's a great description of the techno self. You know, like the new technological self, right? Like a digital self or data flesh. Because the filtering is not just what you do with the screen. Don't you think filtering also comes into your life? Like what you've said, for me, it seems pretty, familiar in a person's own life. Because what you learn in terms of processing information, you begin to do in your own human relationships. You filter out information, you figure out people's perspectives, what possibilities are going to happen here. So you put your filters on in some case, or you sort of blank out certain things you don't want to happen and things like this. And then processing information doesn't just mean, it's not just screen information, it's processing information about a lot of people in your life. So at one point is the technology then sort of mirrored back and you begin to have you're a filtered self. You are an information processor. And you give such an eloquent description of this. Like knowing a lot about, not a great amount about single things, but having a whole variety of perspectives on it and sort of circling around in some ways. Or another way would be, technological self, you begin to see yourself in situations. I mean, we're so accustomed to screens. I mean, you see it in the streets of Montreal all the time. People having a third self, I would call it, or aware of how they're walking down the street, what clothes they're wearing, kind of, what posture, what kind of screensaver body you're putting on for the day and stuff like this. Like I think maybe part of the social effect or the psychological effect of living in information systems is that you learn to live outside yourself a little bit because you can sort of see yourself and things like this. Or what about those tones of voices that you catch? You say, hey, I've heard that tone of voice or I've heard that turn of phrase before, and then you realize you can go right to the TV show. Or dress fashions, you can usually just go to, just watch the videos. Watch MTV and you can pick up a lot of dress fashion and stuff like this. So those are codes which are, I mean, that is cyberspace. That is life in the information system. So, do you want to add to that? Or?
I was just thinking to myself, so I sometimes have insomnia, and one of the things that bothers me when I can't sleep is the speed at which I'm making associations, like just randomly almost, it seems. And I think that that's something that, like, I have deep reservations about the sort of technological culture that is springing up right now, about the directions it's taking, but I also really love it. I'm a web designer and I'm part of it all the time.
Yeah.
So, basically, it's the speed thing. It kind of reminds me of some kind of psychosis sometimes when I'm looking at the internet. It looks like things are associated too much with each other, and it's almost like, when you step back, it looks like insanity embodied, It's just, the associations are so freeform sometimes that it reminds me of like a panic attack or an insomnia, about an insomnia.
Well, that's really great. Yeah. So I just think that's what we should do to a good part in this class, try to like just really go into things deeply like this and say, well, what is this doing to us? What's it do to our perception? What's it do to our mental health? What's it do to social life? And how does, if you travel like in cyberspace like this, what does it change your behavior? What arises from that and things. It's really great descriptions. It's good. I like the panic attacks. It's good though. I wrote once with some other people. I wrote once a book called Panic Encyclopedia. So anytime I hear a panic attack, I'm quite alert to this. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Want a break? Yes. Okay. Now, can I just say, really, here we have a class with a lot of obviously really smart people in the class and great students, but are you feeling reservations about talking because the camera's there and stuff like this, or just haven't found something you want to talk about yet? Because it's not normal, let me tell you. Yeah, people have been asking for a course syllabus, and I only have my one syllabus left, but I'm going to run more copies off. Hello, your attention, please. I'm going to run more syllabi off, and these syllabi will be available on Monday at 12 o'clock in the political science office. If you ask Catherine, either Catherine or Helen, okay, I'll get them run off. And if they're not there, just say, hey, call that idiot and get him to bring down the syllabi. Okay, it's just like, because I have to go to our conference tomorrow and I don't get back to Sunday night. It's a conference on cyberspace. Yeah.
Just wondering about the video of the lectures and like where is that being published?
Ted will tell you.
The site is artsandscience.concordia.ca/poly368.
Okay.
And under the lecture numbers, the videos are up there.
Poly 368 AK. Poly 368 and AK.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I actually said earlier Poly 368. Okay.
So Ted, do you want to repeat that for arts and science?
.concordia.ca.
Wait, hold on. artsandscience.concordia.ca.
/poly368.
AK. Is that right?
You can try it. I don't think you need the AK though.
Whatever. But what kind of systems do you use, by the way? Dial-up?
No.
No, I think you have dial-up, pretty sure. I'm just joking. Okay, what do you use to get into the net? How many people have cable? Okay, about half, approximately half. Yeah, it's different, but it's good. It's okay. Okay, so cable works best if you have dial-up, because Ted gave a report on dial-up, and it was painful,
It's choppy.
choppy. But on the other hand, the voice comes through fine.
Yeah.
So who cares about the other part? The voice is what you need. Yeah, but the voice seemed to work fine, so that was good. And it's pretty, so okay, so that's enough of that. Okay, yeah, so those, the first two lectures are already up on the net, okay? So if you want to review what's going on in the lectures, just go back and check it out on the net. Okay, so let me just very quickly complete this, the two other threads that Michael Benedict talks of. We all be ready to get going? Okay, just want to talk very quickly about the other threads. The first thread is the notion of going into cyberspace, and it's instantaneous, and he says like an electronic case. And the second thread that Benedict talks about that is very much like Marshall McLuhan's writings. Like we talked about last week, where Marshall McLuhan said this. He said, you know, what are media? Media are extensions of human beings. They amplify the senses. They extend the human nervous system. They recreate actually our nervous system on the outside. The media is about connectivity and interactivity, amplifies memory, enhances communication, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's because it's a whole riff of technotopians. I'll repeat for punishment. It's Marshall McLuhan's argument. It's very similar to Michael Benedict's. He says, what are media? And Marshall McLuhan had this as an English professor at the University of Toronto and was almost fired from the university for thinking thoughts like this. He came up with theory of the media, and he says electronic media are really different. He says electronic media are really different because electronic media amplify our senses. They extend the human nervous system, like radio extends the ear, television extends the eye, cyberspace extends consciousness, cinema extends imagination. You know, they take you into spaces, you know, they almost like, it's as if they recreate the human nervous system, which before was sort of locked down inside our flesh, inside our skull. They sort of like recreate the organs of the central nervous system and the human sensorium on the outside. And so McLuhan said, if that's true, if you live in a culture which is really washed over and, you know, really, you know, framed by the mediascape, then it means really ironically and paradoxically that we actually have two nervous systems. We have a nervous system inside our bodies, but we also are living within an externalized nervous system. And McLuhan used a medical term to describe this. He says, what happens to us in a technological culture is ablation, A-B-L-A-T-I-O-N, ablation, which simply means that the nervous system suddenly leaves the privacy of the body and goes public. So McLuhan said we live within our externalized or ablated, I'm just throwing that because that's McLuhan's term that I always used, nervous system. Before we thought our hearing ended with our ears. We know that our eyesight begins and ends with our eyes. We know that our imagination is locked up, within our brain. McLuhan's perspective was really different. McLuhan's, when studied the media, says, well, each of the media seem to mimic an organ of the human body. Like radio really privileges the ear. Television really privileges the eye. Cinema privileges, this kind of, dark, interesting space of the human imagination itself. The act of writing begins to take the act of speech and to begin to externalize it. It does strange things to speech itself. And even if we think about the act of speech, like what happens when human beings begin to utter those first sounds. McLuhan would say when you begin to utter the first sounds anthropologically of human beings, and you begin to do something like put sentences together and tell stories, then suddenly the darkness of the night falls away. And you're no longer simply a nomadic, inveterate hunter, hunting for yourself and trying to survive. Suddenly you're a storyteller. Suddenly you're a member of a tribe. And the darkness is lit up by like the lightning flash of the act of speech and the act of writing itself. You go from a really private person to a public person. So this is part of like the fable or myth of technology that McLuhan told. And then he built on his studies of the act of writing and the act of speech. And then he says, what happens in electronic culture when these media that mimic our organs begin to dominate the culture within which we are? And we no longer really control these media, but the media begin to play us. We have not 2 ears now, but we have 4 ears. We listen to CDs. We think that our eyesight ends with our eyes, but who's to say that we haven't got eyesight that's sort of broken into? Perceptions, that maybe aren't our own perceptions, but have been, we've just found on the media or been fed to us. Who knows where our imagination, which is private, ends, and where what we've gathered by listening to talks or by watching images on the screen or being influenced by music, where that ends. McLuhan would say we really live in a world in which we actually swim within our externalized central nervous system. And so for McLuhan, the media were in fact a very physical phenomena. The media for McLuhan was like an externalized central nervous system. And he says the real danger is that the nervous system begins to play back on us. It's not passive, it's violent. He says because when you create a media, violence will always be done. When you privilege the act of hearing, like when you privilege the act of seeing through television, he says you also then begin to stun human imagination. You really shut down consciousness. People substitute what you've heard on the media for making up your own mind, for a private space. Who's to say what is a private mind? When you begin to do music, McLuhan would say you begin to shut down other senses. Anytime a media hits you, it whaps you on the side of the head and you have a big drop in consciousness, but you have a big reward because another kind of organ of perception begins to open up. So for McLuhan, it was really paradoxical, the situation that happened. And he said, just one sec, he said, usually we never can face up to the fact that there's new media. It's just, who can figure out what they are. So we usually disguise them. We retrieve them in terms of old media itself. Like when you have televisions. Have you ever seen those first televisions? They look like radios with a little screen, but we were accustomed. The previous generation was happy with radios, so that was okay. You could sort of disguise them itself. When you have like a new media like the internet, there's the attempt to say, well, really the internet is like fast writing or something of the sort. Well, if you use the internet, you say, well, the internet is not fast writing. The internet's rewriting writing itself. It's creating new forms of literacy and new forms of communication itself. So McLuhan's thesis, which is, like Wired magazine will not talk about, which says McLuhan's the messiah of the coming of the cyber age, that's not McLuhan. McLuhan had two different sides. He's really schizophrenic in a real mental, real kind of political way, because on the one hand, he really was fascinated and studied media and had a compelling story to tell, but the other side of him was this really pessimistic Catholic thinker. He was a convert late in his life to Catholicism and was a deep cultural pessimist. And he says, we are entering into like a new dark age with the new media, that the media are in fact shutting down political consciousness and people are not going to have minds of their own, and we really are drowning. and we really need to figure out some way of how we're going to deal with themselves. So, and those two sides of McLuhan sort of flipped back and forth. And I don't know, you had your hand up.
I was just thinking when you're talking about how violent, when you're exposed to some media, you experience kind of some kind of pain or some kind of violent reaction to it. I was just thinking it seems like because everyone's becoming able to communicate in that language of cyberspace, it's like everyone is a speaker attached to a microphone, and like the feedback loop is instant, you know, like as soon as you start talking and you put that microphone too close to the actual speaker, everything's so fast, it creates this blindingly loud sound, right?
Yeah.
It seems like that happens sometimes, you know, like you say something and while you're saying it, it's already coming back at you, you know, like
Wow.
I get that sensation from it.
Yeah.
Like a feedback loop.
No, that's great. So what happens, that's such an eloquent commentary on like living with fast feedback loops. Well, the question is what happens to human beings when you're caught in fast feedback loops? Like musically, there's a lot of really great musicians who think about this, eh? Like DJ Spooky or Scanner. Always think about this. Like Scanner, do you know Scanner's music? Robin Rambeau from Britain. And Scanner will come to cities, like he would come to like the city of Montreal. He gave a great performance on St. Lawrence about several years ago. And what he does, he comes to the city and he brings his scanner with him. And he told me once BBC came to interview him and says, "Where's the scanner machine?" And Robin Yosel says, "It's a wee little micro digital device, you know, it's like very small." And they were quite disappointed because it didn't have a big cinematic effect and stuff like this. But Scanner, what he does is he'll go to a city and he will scan the soundscape of the city. Like the performance that he did one night was this tremendous performance because he has had the scanner set up, and what he was doing was he was scanning telephone messages that were he's picking out wireless, you know, cell phone messages through the air, not whole messages, but just fragments of messages itself. Love affairs broken down, a lot of emergency calls, tremendous amount of banalities, dinners, and, you know, just the normal kind of skitsy comments that go on, you hear fragments. And he sort of looped them into the sound system, and then he began to play like drum bass, and then melodies with them, and began to build on the sound. So as you sat and listened there for really an hour, like the performance went on for an hour, you start with like this really eerie sort of fragmented sound from the city of Montreal, and you realize like this is McLuhan's digital nervous system, sound nervous system that you live within all the time. You may hear it or you may not hear it. And what Scanner does, he brings it public, and then he laces into it sort of like what he feels is like the beat of Montreal itself. And for Montreal, he just had this he played this kind of skitsy music performance where he had like really screaming drums on the one hand, and then just falling back into these kind of melodic silences and sort of picking up the beat of the street. And I thought, well, that's pretty good for someone who just came to Montreal to really pick up sort of the internal psychogeography of the streets in some ways. And so when you listen to Scanner's performance, what you're really listening to is you're inside the skin of Montreal, like in one perspective on it. You're inside the skin of Montreal, and the sound of Montreal is playing itself over the crowd itself, and everyone falls into silence. And you know, it's a fast feedback loop itself. So like an artist like Scanner really makes you aware of the feedback loop that we live within all the time. Or what about Japanese noise music? Japanese noise music, which is just at screeching levels, to the point of high velocity sound and intensity of sound, that things, when you listen to it for a while, you don't really even hear. Like for myself, my emotional reaction was I didn't even hear the sound after a while, and it didn't even seem fast. It began to slow down. It's almost like when you reach that point of curvature in light, which light just begins to slow down and go towards a kind of inertial point. And that's like Japanese noise music. So C-Theory, we published a great article by a DJ whose name is Paul Hegarty, Hegarty, who works out of Dublin. And I saw him, he's a great intellectual, like really smart about music theory and everything like this. But he also does Japanese noise music DJing. So I once heard him give a great talk. And then later that night there was a dance and stuff, and suddenly, hey, that's Paul. And then he was really playing this really edgy Japanese noise music. And Japanese noise music, when you listen to it, just sort of plays you over. And it's like the music of, do you know David Christian, Cricket Records and stuff in Montreal? He's another guy. David Christian spends all his day before down in Saint Henri, now he lives close to St. Catharines. And basically, what David Christian listens to all day is the sound of static in the wires. As he says, Montreal always has dirty electricity. And David will take like single static sounds and discharges of static through the wires itself, and then begin to build these really beautiful loops of music through it and stuff. So I think that McLuhan was really right when he says, what do you do when you're living inside your own extended nervous system? And McLuhan says, well, you can either be a passive servo mechanism sort of washed over, you don't even know what's happening to you. You're just fast feedback loop and it's distracted culture. Or on the other hand, you can politically and artistically begin to think, well, what is this language? How do I probe it right back? And McLuhan always said that artists were to read the probes of the future, because they took onto themselves the responsibility of thinking about this new language and finding ways that we could begin to navigate it, which I think was true. And now my experience, just in this last point of the fact when McLuhan says the media aren't passive, but they're active and they work you over violently. I remember the very first time I was reading Marshall McLuhan, I was an undergraduate, and my hometown is Red Rock, Ontario, small pulp and paper mill town, northern shore of Lake Superior. And every summer I would go back and I pull logs for a living. Good paying jobs, but physically crazy kind of work. And I remember one summer I just bought Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media. I'd heard about this book and brought it back. And my job that summer was working in the wood room. And the wood room is this place where the wood comes in from the slasher off the lake, and then they have to get the bark off. So they put it into these drums, which are about 100 feet, about 50 feet wide, and they're just razor blades inside. And roll them around, and the wood, when the bark gets off, spits them out the other end. And as a low person on the pole, my job was to go on top of the drums, which was really a dangerous job because it had all these big chains going around at high velocities. And I had this ice pick, and you're supposed to pick the bark off these moving chains and avoid falling into the drums. And my successor in the job was a guy called One Turn Turner, because he fell into the drums and was spit out the other end. And I didn't really want that fate to be mine. Now, so I'm working in the wood room, and I always get the midnight shift. They give the undergrads get the midnight shifts, 12 to 8. And I'm really, really tired, and I'm reading McLuhan, and it's 110 degrees, summertime, and they have big vats of sluice gates, actually, of salt pills. So you pop salt pills to keep your sweat down and stuff like this. You're reading McLuhan, and the lights are, these fluorescent lights, and they're blurry, and you're worrying about the next time you have to go up on top of the drums and hope you won't fall in and stuff. And I'm reading McLuhan saying, the medium is the message. The medium's an invisible field of violence, and it works you over. And I kept thinking to myself, what does the guy mean by the medium is the message, that it's an invisible force? And I sort of didn't realize that I was literally working right inside a medium of the wood room, which is a technology. And it was like a really invisible but sort of visible field, and was really working me over in terms of my emotions and my physical safety. And it was really, really violent. So whenever I read McLuhan these days, I always can smell the paper, and I can certainly hear those wood drums going in the background itself. So that's the first time I read Marshall McLuhan and stuff like this. And McLuhan, was really influential because he really led people to think about the invisibility. He really made visible the invisible world of the mediascape. And that's the third thread that Michael Benedict talks about. Michael Benedict said it's really he said the third thing that cyberspace does is that it has a certain kind of movement, that it always moves from the material to the electronic. It always moves, it always becomes more invisible. It becomes smaller. It begins to attach itself to your body. And media itself doesn't become static, but media becomes very mobile. We become electronic nomads. And there's lots of electronic nomads around these days. Businessmen like to say they're road warriors, right? Until their hearts pop out and they have heart attacks and stuff. And then, or they're probably like businessmen are really McLuhan's probes of the future. It's poor businessmen who every day have to go to the airports and go through really heavy surveillance systems and get used to taking their shoes off. And at the same time, they have to think about fighting for their, clubbing together and fighting for their life if anything goes wrong on airplanes and stuff. I say, well, it's not so much artists anymore as probes of the future. It's just businessmen who don't really have any choice, because if they're a road warrior, they got to be on the road, and that's just part of their job itself. But they are really, right at the kind of gates of inferno of the technology, of these kind of technologies of surveillance and technologies of speed itself. So Michael Benedict would say the history of the media moves from a physical, pre-literate way of doing things to a post-literate, symbolic way of thinking. It's from a pre-literate, physical way of doing things to a post-literate symbolic way of doing things. And what we've been talking about this whole class is the fact that we really do live in a symbolic universe. So when we talk about cyberspace, we're really talking of, screen culture. We're talking about, information systems. We're talking about the fact that we are like connected monads. And often people will say, well, I don't want to be connected. And the only response I can give is that's, like a really great impulse. And it's really, I think, a really critical impulse of a lot of people to say, hey, I want to get disconnected. I want to really become aware of the point, where I begin and sort of this thing ends. The only difficulty with, if this McLuhan is correct, cyberspace is also a system of domination. It doesn't, you might want to be disconnected from you, but it doesn't necessarily want to be, you might want to be disconnected from it, but it doesn't want to be necessarily disconnected from you. And it's got its probes very deeply inside each of us in terms of all the media and how they work us over all the time. And really, for purposes of survival, who can survive? It's very difficult to survive now if you don't engage in some form of digital commerce. Like the simplest thing is going to a bank machine itself. It's very difficult to know your culture if you don't watch television or go on the net. And it's very difficult to travel if you don't take airplanes. I mean, airplanes in the United States particularly are buses, basically. They're just, American airports are astonishing. About 10 years ago, they stopped being like airports in the old sense of, like a different media than bus. And they just struck me, they become like sort of casual bus service. Cheap flights, and people would take them, go away for weekends and stuff like that. So we are connected nomads in intensive media cultures. And all the articles in this book are going to ask one after the other, what are the consequences of this? Yep.
I think, when you're talking about all these media is becoming an extension of our nervous system, I think it's a responsibility of the person to, no matter how much we're plugged in, to always be watching how that is affecting us,
Yeah.
right? It's like those kids who go out and do all these violent acts because they say they saw the movies, therefore that's what they thought was right. I think that people need to have an objective point of view, right? You go into the internet, but still be aware of at what point it is overcoming you and at what point you're choosing and selecting information.
Yeah.
There's, music is constantly around us and TV, but you can choose not to watch TV if you don't want to. You can choose not to become a child who's, or a human who sits in front of the tube 8 hours a day and all your references are from TV, right?
Yeah. No, so there's a real matter of choice. But what if you switch, can I just ask you a question? What if you switch media and talk about food, for example? So I'm looking at this wonderful organic food right here. And what if you're like really conscious of what you're eating and you really prefer to eat healthy food as opposed to, say, genetically engineered food? For myself, I think I'm pretty suspicious of it. So you say, okay, I'm going to really try to avoid genetically engineered food, even though the Canadian government, basically doesn't allow any labeling to that effect to go on food. So you have to really do a little research and figure out. So you finally say, oh, soy seems like a very good substitute for things. So I think have soy. Say, then you find out later soy is probably the most genetically engineered food around and things like this. And anyway, it's begun to slip into the food stream. And media, in McLuhan's sense, is invisible in terms of its effects. It works us over. It becomes the culture that it begins to eat the culture in a certain way. If you, like say in this class, anyone who's interested in doing like a paper on fast food. I mean, fast food is really the fast food industry. There's such good writing going on in this. And it's really a powerful media in McLuhan's sense of the term. It really is a cyberspace.
Yeah, I think you have to find a balance in it, right? Because if you talk about food, you can get so suspicious. The only choice you really have if you don't want to eat genetically engineered is move out to a farm and do all your own food, right? And everyone can't do that. So when there's no control over that and everything that is being produced is engineered, you have to find, I guess, your balance of, the fast food nation and as, organic as you can get it, to which extent, how organic is that, right?
Yeah, no, that's really nice. So your point would be that you really need to, within reasonable limits,
Yeah,
just
well,
try to
yes,
create.
I mean, we're not all going to move out the country and
Detox.
detox ourselves, right? But I really think it's each person's responsibility engineered by everything coming in at us.
Yeah.
And I think, I agree with it's the artist as a probe of the future and looking at
Yeah. And
what ways to go.
no, that's good. In particular, when you move out to the farm, you find that it's usually toxicological zones. You know, really, acid rain's coming down on top of your head. The forests are dead. And there's, again, where northern Ontario, where I come from, if you go to walk in the forest, you walk in the forest to your own. There'll be signs on the road saying, don't get off the road because there's chemical spraying that's just taken place. So it's a sunny day and you look for some shade under the tree, but suddenly you realize all the forest for hundreds of miles has been cut down all on top, all around you, and that the only forest left in northern Ontario, little cosmetic strips of forest along the highways, so that the tourists will come and they'll say, oh, what a nice forest we have. But if you go like 50 feet off the road, I'm sure this is true in northern Quebec as well, there is no forest to be found. British Columbia is the same thing. British Columbia prides itself. In fact, the government even has these kind of really cynical, what I view as cynical signs. If you drive up island, northern Vancouver Island, you see these beautiful peaks that once time had great forests on there, just stripped. So they're like stumps, like they've had a brush cut or something of the sort. And there'd be usually signs on that that say, a working forest, working for you. So I say, oh, just like the cynicism of this thing, and also the lack of a balanced perspective on nature is just pretty astonishing and stuff. So, media. Yes?
Sorry, I just think at the same time, while it is completely like one of the most fundamental and important things to try to, keep that kind of objectivity, as she was saying, it's becoming harder and harder and more overwhelming. I find to have these, there aren't really very many alternatives, as she's saying. Like you've got to basically move out to a farm if you want to eat
Don't.
regular food, right? But I mean, just an example, like I feel like I'm pretty informed relatively as much as I can,
Yeah.
whatever, but there's one evening I was watching the Sunday primetime business. It was like The Simpsons and King of the Hill and like Pop Stars or something.
That's pretty good, actually.
I watched those shows I was in front of the TV for 3 hours, and the 5-minute commercial intervals were only like, there's only 3 commercials, I think, like 2 of them were for McDonald's and 1 of them was for a car. And after just that 3 hours, I craved eating McDonald's so much. Like I hate McDonald's. Every time I eat it, I get sick, but I craved it. And the next day, I had to like drag Tessa with me to go eat McDonald's, and I got sick, of course. But just that psychological feeling of like I had to have it. I was really surprised that it actually, happened on me, and I always assumed that I was above that kind of,
Pleasures,
brainwashing,
great pleasures.
So
Yeah, that's really interesting. So sort of an intensive experience and stuff. Yeah.
It's just surprising that it's still, like, no matter how well informed and how objective you think you can stand outside of these kinds of
Yeah.
constructs, it's
Yeah. No, it's good because the money in television is not put into the shows, which are like after product. The money in television is put into the advertisements. And people usually say, oh, who cares about the advertisements? The advertisements are where the really, creativity, really heavy focus grouped, really intensively. I think if you studied the advertising industry, you find in the advertising industry all the modern language of propaganda. Like how do you really put hooks inside people and do it in a language which is not oppressive, but a language which is really seductive? And how do you do it in such a way that, in fact, people will say, oh, it's sort of natural and I want this, and things like this. I think if you study the advertising industry, that's what you begin to find, actually. Just
I've been to focus groups, like I know how their tactics, and there's tricks behind it, but I was just surprised that even knowing all this and being against McDonald's, ethically and everything, like all of that put together still didn't stop that just 3 hours of watching TV. I thought it was crazy.
that's pretty interesting. That's nice. That's a great story. Yeah?
I think when we're talking about the objectivity, like keeping objective points of view, it's like it's because I think it's becoming harder. It's because the frame of reference is just getting so huge. Like it's so hard to find a frame of reference that's outside of the media for anything.
That's
And
true.
like when I walked down the street on September 11th and I was between classes, I heard the most times out of anything I heard that day, people on their saying it's like a movie. That's what I heard about a million times. Like everyone I talked to was like, oh, it looked exactly like a movie. So the movie became the real frame of reference for something real. And that's like I was just, my head was spinning that whole day because I didn't see the actual images until I got home from school at night, and I heard, you know, the wild rumors and all this stuff. And when I did get home, they're right. It looked like a movie. I mean, it really looked like a digital effect, you know. And so I
Yeah.
can understand like some people with their conspiracy theories about everything. I mean, like really, now that the media frame of the frame of reference we have in reality is the media. Now that we have this revolution in media where you can make anything look real, it's like that objectivity is like disappearing fast. You know,
Yeah.
everything is so subjective, especially when you've got one major news network and one guy in Canada pretty much who owns the media. I mean, it's like, I mean, that frame of reference is either huge or tiny now. I can't decide
good.
which.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And the kind of, it's a very specific kind of movie. It's like 1950s Japanese horror films, where the Japanese themselves were working out, I think in movies, were working out, you know, really responses, psychologically responses to the fact that they had had atomic weapons dropped in their cities. And that, I think the way in which that one way it began to express itself in the culture was a whole genre of Japanese horror films, like monsters visiting cities. Well, those monsters were also the specter of other monsters which had visited Japanese cities. So the kind of movie, and who's maybe in fact, you know, like there's a very good French thinker again, this Paul Virilio, really good thinker to read. And Paul Virilio says that cinema's had such a massive effect on us that almost life is like living like in an unwinding film strip in some ways, and like he calls it cinematic derealization. It's almost like life itself is like this sort of unwinding of a movie in some ways, and you sort of see yourself fitting into it in some ways. So good, it's a good point. Any comments from over here? This side of the room is being very quiet. Okay, while you're waiting,
I wanted
yes.
to go back on the point of commercials
Yes.
and how I don't think we're getting that kind of brainwashed by the commercials because we're seeing different tactics always. We're always
true.
seeing different tactics by the commercial people who are making commercials.
Yeah.
Now the biggest thing is product placement in like videos and movies and like TV
And game,
shows.
and computer games.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is like, there's always going to be a new tactic. And this is why, like, I don't think we're getting more dumber because we as human beings are getting actually smarter because we're always seeing it before them saying, oh, I see that there. You gotta find a new tactic to make me buy some McDonald's next time. So I don't think, I mean, we're getting that more brainwashed during time.
Well, that's such a good thesis. So that thesis would be that we're not getting brainwashed because we're ahead of the media is really good, because it might be that in fact the media is always desperately trying to catch up to people who are really electronically smart already, know their desires or likes, and are already speeding ahead, and they have to find new ways of speaking to you. Yeah, it's a really good point. Yes, and then over here.
Objection is that just because we see it doesn't mean it's not working. Like we see it billboards all the time, so we know that they're advertising that way. Does that mean billboards don't work? They still work on us. So just because we see that they're advertising to us in a new way, I don't think it means that it's not working anymore. I think it means they want to find a new way to sell a little bit better.
Well, that's really good. So what's your response to that? Dirty, eh?
I mean, it's funny to know that marketing is just a way of buying things, but I mean, don't you feel like oppressed when you see like those billboards and you feel like, all right, am I going to buy into it or not? You have to. It's a moral question at the end.
It
At the end
doesn't
of the day,
matter
it's a
if you
moral
feel.
question.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say it doesn't matter if you feel oppressed or not by the advertising. It's not like just because you see it there and you feel oppressed by it, you're gonna automatically say, "Well, I just saw a Tide billboard, so I'll never buy Tide ever again." Like that takes a lot more effort than just to like. I don't think anyone in this culture is willing to put that effort to like remember every single ad they've seen that they felt oppressed by, and make a list of I will not buy these products anymore because I felt oppressed by them at one time. Like that's just way too much effort that anyone can put out there in like today's world. Like.
And also, we identify with commodities so much. I mean, how many Hilfiger T-shirts did I see on the way to school today and stuff like this? Or, you know, it's not even with particular products. What about those new British billboards for cigarettes, where in fact they're simply colors? They're chromatic billboards. They come out of Japan. They're just like slight, which are copyright colors of the color spectrum itself, like red for certain cigarettes. And the association is so deep, you don't even have to bother anymore putting the names of the company or the product. You just have a billboard with a slight edge of red which goes down the side. It's like in Tokyo, did I tell you about Sony's newest advertisements in Tokyo? Sony's got its newest, which they haven't come to North America because North America's too slow for tech and something, I think, from Sony's perspective, and they try everything out in Japan. And the newest billboard for Sony is simply they took a side of a big skyscraper and they got an ad company from a company, very good company, an interesting company of young cyberpunks actually from Britain, from London, called Tomato Design, and said, represent it for us, Sony. And so what they did is they did a video which goes on the side of a building, which is run off computer screens, of course. And what it doesn't say anything about Sony at all. It just has a gaseous matrix. That's all. And it sees and moves. It's like seeing like in the nebula, into space. And the speed and velocity and the changes for it are invisibly triggered by things like the rise and fall of Sony shares on the stock market. How many people are walking or driving down the street at any given time? How many Sony products are being sold on the global market itself? So when Sony does well, then you're seeing into a nebula, it begins to be violent and move very fast. Or if it's, if it's slowing down, then it gets stationary itself. And I was given a talk in Florence with these guys from Tomato, and they said that it was very hard for them to convince the Sony executives who were shocked by this, that this is how their company had come to. And they said, well, the executives themselves did not understand that Sony is a new form of capitalism. Its capitalism is like a matrix. It's like capitalism is like it's so ubiquitous and drains down on everyone in terms of so many products that people buy that it's like a Sony universe. And so you really should represent it like that. And they said the bureaucrats in Sony were just like sort of shocked because they had much more, they like product placement of things that you could see and things like this. But I thought the people from Tomato Design really were smart because they really understood the notion of what commodities have come to mean now. They're not just items. They are like a kind of McLuhanite kind of sea that we swim within that have a lot to do with desires, the speed with which we like to live, or, they're just like necessary parts of life itself. And for advertising would mean that these are like, it's like Claude Lebrec, the Quebec filmmaker, said, it's like technology is like snow. It keeps falling and you sort of keep shoveling in some ways. It's not something outside of ourselves. It's like survival items in some ways. So it just makes the point, really good point you made, really complex. I mean, at what point is that the language of domination? At what point is it something else? So I'm sorry. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to mention the fact that, because we're all talking about advertising and technology, things that are affecting people. I would say that if anything, it's becoming more insidious because the people are smarter, and the advertising companies realize this, that they're not affected by the old schema. So they develop certain products or campaigns that will affect a person, but without realizing them, like she just said. She saw one commercial, and then she had this huge craving. The next day, she went down and bought it. But I would say that she's educated, and so she knows the previous campaign. But here, one thing quickly, I want to buy it, I'm going to go out and get it. So this result just shows how affected, or more so, because technology is so integrated to our lives, how the smallest thing can just cause drastic changes in the long run.
Yeah, it's nice. Did anyone else here on this side? Because I saw two hands go up. Okay, here and then back here. Yes? Yeah,
okay.
yep.
Well, because I think marketers are realizing how people are getting smarter when they're watching a movie and they see a Pepsi advertisement and everything. So what they're trying to do now is that I read somewhere in the newspaper that they have actual people going to social situations and they're actually advertising, marketers, and they're talking to people directly, but without letting them know that they're from the company.
Yeah.
So they go, let's say, a tourist would go, let's say, to St. Joseph Oratory, and he'll have this fancy camera, let's say from Sony or something, and he would tell, let's say, a tourist, can you please take a picture of me? So then the tourist, oh, sure, and then at the same time, oh, this is a great camera, yeah, it's a Sony camera, it's the latest one, this is featuring this and that. And the same thing they also use in nightclubs too, to advertise the new latest vodka drink.
It's called guerrilla advertising.
Yeah, so I mean,
you have to
on now media because they know people like, oh, look, Pepsi's now supporting this movie, and like people are getting more smart about it. So.
No, it's really good. I spent some time in the summer in Toronto in a place called Kensington Market, which is really like the old plateau in Montreal. And when I was there, there's this really cool place opened up. And I thought, oh, it must be some art students have opened this great place up. It's a place that opens up in like sort of like a little empty storefront, like a small little factory kind of thing. Like a place where you'd have cars would be repaired, but it was emptied out. And so they opened up, and I thought, well, here's some students are doing some interesting project. And they brought in like a whole series of music groups would, on a nightly basis, would be in there, and suddenly the neighborhood's flooded with cyberpunk and stuff like this. And the kids look really cool. I went in, they had an opening day thing. I thought, oh, this is very strange. I haven't seen art students are serving cake on opening day and little sandwiches and stuff. Well, these are Toronto cyberpunk or something like this. So it goes along, and it's all very nice. And then I leave Toronto, go out to the West Coast, and then I read the papers, and they said this was, in fact, a whole Nike plant. The whole thing was a Nike product placement for their next running shoes or something that they're going to bring out. And when the real punks who live in Kensington Market, which is hardcore punk culture in Toronto, found out about this, they surrounded the building and began pelting the building with tomatoes and stuff like this. And they trapped Sony executives, Nike executives inside who were too scared to come out and stuff like this. so they were probably back in their boardroom saying, oh, this guerrilla advertising's got like a downside to it too. But it's definitely the thing, eh? Yeah, so, yes.
Yeah, actually one of my friends.
No, go ahead first.
One of my friends was hired to do exactly that, and it's just too funny. Like, first there's all this secrecy, like, I can't tell you what the product is, and they hire these attractive, like, models and actresses, and you have to be, like, beautiful to do it. And they were just going to bars, and they had specific locations. They had to go at certain times, like the bathroom or the bar, and they'd casually start this conversation about the product and hopefully dropping on them. And they'd be like, so what do you think? It's too funny.
It's completely lunatic, really. Yeah, it is.
So if anyone hears any suspiciously loud conversations about certain products,
yeah. Well, that's really, these are great stories of, because it's really like the demise of capitalism, when it's lost confidence in itself and it's sort of desperately trying to catch up to people. So, did you had your hand? I'm sorry, we didn't get to you soon.
The comments kind of, or whatever. I was just going to say that even if everybody thinks that, or we think that we're much more sophisticated in watching advertising, advertising works. It's 100% effective. Even if we think we're being above it and objective about it, it works. There's a reason why it's such a huge industry.
Yeah.
It works, and we're also not the norm here in this class either. People in this class are highly educated, and the average person might not also be as effective, as critical of it as we are, but we're still affected by it too, and it's totally effective. Even if we like to think that it's not, it completely is.
These are chilling words. Sound very truthful. Yeah, that's a really good comment.
Guerrilla advertising thing, it's kind of nice to talk about at the end of the class, like with all the talk of the sort of high-tech ways that we're getting insidiously brainwashed. It's like, how low-tech can you get, right back down to like a smoky bar with a conversation you're overhearing,
I know some of you think you're having a beginning of a great relationship with, and you realize you're in a product placement videos. That's pretty. It's a pretty wild story, actually. Well, it's really. That would be a very interesting thing. That thread to investigate would be pretty interesting, actually. Like what's happening to capitalism itself, when in fact it finds it's going slower than the culture, and when it feels a kind of desperation. It's like just end with one story. A friend of mine she does focus groups. Works out at San Francisco, and she did a product. She did I'll tell you, it was for Clorox. I'll tell you the brand. And they said, well, can you go out in the field and find out how people are actually using our cleaning products? So she did this ethnographic study all across the United States and found out wild stories. And she said, no one ever reads the label on bottles that you're not supposed to mix cleaning products together, or they have explosions happen and toxic. And she said, everyone she's talked to many people seem to have their own particular combinations, a little bit of Clorox, a little bit of bleach, Javex and stuff. People do their own kind of concoctions. And then she said some people regularly at the end of their cleaning would then take Clorox and put it down like in the shower and stuff like this, any drains. And she'd say, why are you doing that? They say, chase the devil out of the house. And she said this was repeated all the way across the United States. So she said when she went back and she did videos of people showing these strange, and she said, first of all, the executives were aghast that their products were being used in this way. Because they said, if you mix that, people are going to die. You know, these are toxic potions. And she said at the end, they all got up, and she said they had never, these poor executives had never seen, they'd never had any relationship to actual people using their products. And she said they were like emotionally swept away by this complexity and what they were doing in the culture. They all got up and they gave her a standing ovation for it. So when I heard that story, I thought, well, you know, you have to really revise. Like it alternates between the advertising is 100% effective, but at the other hand, does capitalism really know where it's going? Does cyberspace really know where it's going? Is it sort of staggering from, you know, from one dimension to one dimension? So we'll try to figure that out where it's going. So let me just conclude. Let's begin next class, and I'll just talk briefly about Arturo Escobar's, you know, next article, which really writes this to questions of power and class and gender, and then we'll go on to part 2 of the book. So next class. Okay. Meanwhile, please give some thought to your research essay project and things. And the other final thing is, I don't know if I said it, but if you feel more comfortable writing in French in your both the essay or the project or any of the exams, you should 100% write in French. I read French very well, so that would be great. So if you just feel more comfortable, that's what you should do. Okay?